brothers, do you recall when the grasslands reached to the horizon? And the deafening roar of countless wings overhead. Back when Rome was a village at Britain, the Emerald Island. Before we gave up on our future and buried our dead.
We are on our episode, I believe, 35, is it? I think it is 35. That's crazy. Can't believe it's been going for this long, and I don't even want to know what it's going to be once we get closer to modern days and times. But so last time we pretty much ended our story on the Athenians having to abandon Athens and escape to the island of Salamis and try to figure out what to do. And again, this is our episode 35. Just want to send out a shout out to Marwaen and to Herodotus, among other things, though not all of his information is very solid, and also to everybody else who's done amazing, all the scholars, all across the globe who've done the amazing research on this much complicated political, military, and sociological history, not to mention, civilization formative history that we're going to be talking about. So as we remember, when the Second Greco-Persian War, when the Greeks found out that Persians were marching against them after all, first thing that they did was panic. Then they panicked some more, and then they tried to gather up all the Greek city-states to try to form some sort of an alliance to fight against the impending doom. And out of over 800 various policies, according to different accounts, either 31 or 41 responded to that particular cry for help. So at the time when we left our Persian army, they have managed to get across Thermopylae. Leonidas is dead. Spoiler for anybody who hasn't seen the movie 300, which I don't believe there are many. And so Athenians knew that they had no choice but to basically run from their city. Now, there were some hotheads who wanted to stand their ground and fight to the death. And those who wanted to stay their ground and fight to the death were very few. In the end of the long debate, majority of the Athenians got onto their lovely ships that they managed to build, and with the assistance from their very charismatic and very empowering leader. And those few who remained behind, mainly the priests locked up in the temples who remained behind to defend those sacred sites, they were pretty much slain. And so now we have Athenians who are Greeks. As we remember in Greek polis, you either are a citizen or you are a nobody. Well, now the entire population of Athens, according to the Greek standards, is pretty much nobodies. But they're the nobodies with the biggest, most modern, up-to-date fleet. And as all the Greeks sit on the island of Salamis, there is, of course, basically an argument over the leadership. And we also remember that Sparta and Athens have always butted heads, and they are kind of the two heads of this snake, or whatever you want to call it, that's called Greece. They're two opposing powers, and Spartans are formidable land warriors, to where Athenians at this point in time are aspiring to be the naval power. Here is the track of the Persian land army across their empire, across the conquered lands, and then into their targets, which is going to be over here. Now, Marathon is where things happened last time, when the Persians tried to come this way. This time, as we remember, they decided to take the roundabout route. And the next map, if I remember right, shows us the fleet. So the fleet is pretty much shadowing the land army, trying to assist it. And as we remember, right after, almost simultaneously, was the standoff at Thermopylae, there was also another battle that took place. And that was the Battle of Artemisium, which was fought more or less to try to prevent the Persian fleet from getting around the Thermopylae blockage and hitting the troops who were blocking Thermopylae in the back. But after Thermopylae fell, that's when the rest of the allied fleet joined the Athenians on the island of Salamis. And I'm going to go forward to that one. That's a little bit later on. So a debate is happening once the Greeks all gather up on Salamis. Of course, the Spartans, being the epic and magnificent Spartans, who are not very happy that so far kind of a one-on-one count in the who defeated more Persians, because last time, as we remember, during the First Greco-Persian War, it was the Athenians who held off the Persian invasion without the Spartans. Spartans were busy with a religious celebration, and at Thermopylae, it was the Spartans who kind of won the day, so the count is 1-1. So the Spartans, being the epic Spartans, are wanting to do the land defense of the remaining area. Can you pull up a map, David? That might be a good idea, because I don't have a map that doesn't actually have any.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry. Anyway, and the Athenians, of course, having lost Athens at this point in time, really do not want to allow the navy of the Persians to advance much further. They want to go ahead and fight the battle, basically a navy battle, because they have this very clever leader and they have this newly built and shiny fleet. And the Spartans and the rest of the Greeks are more or less leaning towards blocking off the advance of the Persians past the area that they have already crossed, past Athens, past Corinth, and into the rest of Greece. There's a lot of arguments, and of course, the other Greeks don't take a pause to throw it into the face of the Athenians that, guess what, you're really not quite citizens of anything anymore. Your Athens is kind of under occupation. So who are you to really tell us what to do around here? Well, to which the Athenians reasonably respond with, well, you know what? We're the ones with the biggest fleet here. And so if you don't want us to be a decisive factor in this council, then we can just pack up all of our stuff and all of our people. We already have all the ships pretty much packed anyway, and we can go, we have a nice colony somewhere in Sicily. Maybe we can just go and just all live there, and you deal with the Persians all on your own. There's a heated debate. There's even that famous phrase from one of the debates when one of the Greek leaders tried to stand up and hit the Athenian leader, to which Thermopylae at that point in time stood up to the opposing Greek leader and said, go ahead and hit me if you want to hit me, if you want to go down that route, but hear me out. We need to go ahead and stop this advancing enemy fleet and make sure that we knock out basically their seaside supplies so that the land army does not have a supply line anymore from the fleet. And once that happens, then we can go ahead and deal with the land force of the Persians. Well, he manages to convince the rest of the Greeks very tentatively to maybe try to follow that particular course of action. So, on the other hand, Xerxes is holding council with his peeps, and Mardonius, which is his land general, is urging speedy advance, to where some of the other advisors are not so keen on necessarily being so forceful in their progress. Even some of them propose that maybe we can just try to bribe some of the leaders of the Greeks, kind of sow some discord among them, and maybe we can get some of them to switch over to our side, because they already have lost quite a few of their troops during just the standoff at Thermopylae, plus they remember the Marathon disaster. But Xerxes is not happy. Xerxes wants to be a glorious, victorious king. And I'm going to back up a little bit just and talk about Xerxes' motivation here. So back to Xerxes. Now, I just want to give you a little bit of a psychological portrait of this lovely king. We've talked about it a little bit before. And I think Nathan said it the best during our last conversation. The little joke about Darius looking at Xerxes and saying, "My, do you have a big eraser?" And then Xerxes looking at Darius and saying, "My, did you have a big pencil?" Right? Well, when Xerxes came to power, of course, like it is the case with a lot of new kings, they always try to outshine, outtopple, and outperform their predecessor. And of course, Darius did have this one objective in his life that he did not succeed at. And that is the fact that he did not manage to punish the meddling Greek city-states for basically intervening into the internal affairs of the Persian state. Simply because he got distracted and then he passed away. And so when his son came to the throne, that particular concern was a kind of a thorn in his side. Now, like any new king, especially a new king in those times when you did not have TV, you did not have internet, you did not have any other way to show yourself to your subjects, a king generally would tour his territories, oftentimes so that subjects would at least know that they actually have a ruler, so that they could see this beautiful procession at least from a distance and recognize the fact that there is such a person, that there is a state, that there's a head of state, and that their lands are under a strong, glorious, powerful, magnificent hand of some sort of godlike creature. And so Xerxes, of course, undertook this entire enterprise, I think, with the desire to outshine his father. And of course, the first part of his progress was quite successful. I mean, he quite easily marched through the states of Macedonia, Thrace, Thessaly, and did not have much of a problem. And of course, before that, the Persians in the previous conflict had managed to successfully suppress all the Greek Ionian city-states after the Ionian rebellion. So at this point in time, Xerxes, who just relatively recently ascended to the throne, I mean, not very recently, but relatively recently, and who has had more or less complete success in most of his undertaking. I mean, he may have had a little bit of a lack of understanding of what he was dealing with as far as the Greeks went, as far as their capacity, also as far as their terrain that he was going to be facing, and as far as his own military capacity. The Persians were very successful military. I know that in the Western world, we mostly look at the Persians in the light of somebody who lost to the Greeks, but in reality, they had a fairly formidable military machine. Their military machine was adopted, especially in the beginning, very much modeled after the Assyrian military machine, which we have talked about, and we all know just how brutal and how successful that particular organization was. Persians had cavalry, of course, them being from the Aryan stock, from the Indo-European stock. They were good horsemen, and they were very capable cavalry. They also had light infantry, which mostly consisted, of course, of archers. And also they had, at the beginning, they also adopted from the Assyrians the heavy infantry. Because, again, the Persian state was born on the ruins of the Median state. And the Median state was the first budding, formation, I guess, state formation in that territory that was in the European origin and managed to take over whatever was left of the Assyrian Empire and absorb a lot of the Assyrian imperial tactics, both bureaucratic and military. And so when the Persians in turn absorbed the Medians, they also absorbed all the new warfare tactics and methods that the Medians have managed to develop during their time of, during their heyday. And so in the beginning, they very much did employ the heavy infantry, but towards the time we're talking about, the Persians have been fighting mostly opponents that oftentimes did not have cavalry like they did, and who oftentimes did not have heavily armored troops, heavily armed infantry. And so what the Persians have gotten used to doing, they have more or less renegated the role of the heavy infantry to the very elite Persian nobility, members of Persian nobility. And they, at this point in time, served more or less two functions. They either functioned as a last line of defense, or kind of a protective attachments with the light infantry, which were mainly archers, or they were a lead guard, kind of the king's guard. I mean, I'm not saying that they were decorative by any means, but they were not as actively deployed in the battlefield at the time that we're talking about. And this can be actually seen quite clearly if we go back a little bit to the Battle of Thermopylae, because originally, if you look, even at the most cliche description of that battle, you hear about how there were Persians originally threw warriors and warriors and warriors upon the heavily armored Greeks, and those warriors. Here's the thing: in Thermopylae, you had a really narrow passage. Right? Let me pull up my map. From Thermopylae, actually, really quick. But we all can kind of imagine what Thermopylae looked like. I mean, it was a narrow passage that was on the one side cliffs, and on the other side was, rocky outcrops. And so cavalry really did not have any way to attack there. I mean, horses are not going to, like we said last time, horses are not going to rush against the wall of armored men who all have spiky things pointing at them. And originally, the Persians tried to just send their light infantry. They figured that if they throw enough arrows at these Greeks, the Greeks are going to basically break up, and then they can pursue them either with by the means of cavalry, which I'm not sure how usable cavalry would have been at the Battle of Thermopylae just due to the terrain, or simply just showering them with arrows as they ran away. Well, the Greeks did not buck, they did not go away. And so after losing so many light infantrymen, basically his non-elite, his generic military, Xerxes got angry, and what he did is he tossed at the Greeks his own equivalent of the hoplites, which was the immortals, which was his own personal elite guard. At which point in time, the immortals, which are described as mostly being armed with swords, went up against hoplites who were more heavily armored than them. That was the last-ditch effort by Xerxes. It was a last-ditch measure, and we can kind of infer that from the point of view is that even Herodotus in his descriptions talks about how upon sending the immortals on against the Greeks, Xerxes sat on his throne to watch how his Persians would be fighting now. Of course, the entire army is his army, but not entire army is necessarily Persians. And I think that phrase is very telling in the sense that he sent his best, his brightest, his most dependable troops against this very annoying blockage, really, in the passage. Go ahead, David. Let me go ahead and silence.
That's the difference. This Persians, a so-called immortal, one of the feudal best of the Persians, but he's still comparatively lightly armored. The bow is very much his principal weapon. This big shield is basically to allow people behind him to shoot, to unloose arrows. This is very much like the Assyrians. A lot of those Eastern armies were equipped this way. The Greek was almost fully, this is a meter-wide shield, bronze covered, a weapon in itself. Their spears would tend to be about 25% longer than the Persian spears. Bronze breastplate, full helmet, in a phalanx with the greaves, all but about 5.5% of his body is covered. So it was a much heavier infantry. This scale armor that the Persian has a fatal flaw in that it's sewn to leather. But if you go under the scales, you can pierce it because they just slides up under it. And generally, they just weren't as heavily armored as the Greeks were. This is a much better, the Persian would have a much better open field battle, and particularly if supported with cavalry, as they usually were. That doesn't always work well in Greece, because mountains and rocks and things like that don't do good for cavalry. So the hoplite here would become the standard heavy infantry and would set the tone even for as far forward as Rome, although theirs would be modified quite a bit. But for the next, through Alexander's time, again, there'd be some modifications, a longer spear, a smaller shield. But generally, the hoplite would be for the next 250 years, the premier heavy infantry warrior.
Yeah, no, and very much to what David was talking about. The Persian army was a reflection of the Persian Empire, and it was a levied army. It was not a standing army, and so it would be called into times of service when it was required. And so the various, if you will, heads of state in their various regions would be called upon to raise an army.
And you're absolutely right. I mean, the thing is, Persian tactics were designed for Persia. They were designed for open fields. They were designed for fighting in a situation when you had a lot more maneuvering room. They were also not designed for close combat whatsoever.
Right. And can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. I changed networks. So when you the Persian army was very much used to confronting a different kind of adversary,
Right.
And that's what they were geared to, and it was very effective. And I feel that they kind of underestimated what they were running into with the Greeks.
Absolutely.
And which is, with all of the interpolitical issues that the Greeks had with themselves, the fact that they could present such a homogeneous fighting force is kind of baffling.
Yep, absolutely. And I think that this frustration at Thermopylae is what drove a lot of the decision. I really do get the impression, I mean, I'm not entirely trusting of Herodotus as far as his description of the Persians, neither the numbers, nor honestly the customs, nor the characters of individual personalities. But I think that one thing that comes up over and over when talking about Xerxes is the fact that he was fairly hot-tempered. And I think that at least whether or not individual instances that are described, for example, the fact that he desecrated the body of Leonidas after the Battle of Thermopylae, I mean, whether or not those individual instances of him whipping the sea or him throwing a fit here, throwing a fit there, but overall, it seems to me that he was not as calculated as his father was, a bit impatient. And so I think that's what pushed his decision to, against the advice of his own admirals, of the advice of his own, a lot of his own councilmen, to go ahead and try to pursue the Greeks in a naval confrontation at Salamis, because he could have, if he really wanted to, just avoided that confrontation altogether. But he decided to go ahead and try to fight. And so what happened at that point in time is that the Persians kind of approached the narrow passage of Salamis. Let me pull that up. I have my maps here. I'm just going to go to my maps all organized. I'll just, where's my Salamis? So the Persians approached the Salamis, which is a really narrow passage, but they were very hesitant to enter it. And so for a while, there was a standoff between the two forces. Neither the Greeks nor the Persians moved forward. Now, when the Athenians were retreating from their home city, they left behind them many propaganda messages for the Ionian allies that the Persians had with them. Themistocles was a very cunning man. I mean, he was very politically astute. And so he figured that at best, he is going to be able to maybe induce some of the Ionian Greek allies of the Persians to maybe not be so keen on fighting their fellow Greeks. At worst, he would put a wedge between the Persians and their Greek allies by this propaganda, because if the Persians stop trusting their Greek allied forces, that might cause a problem. And later on, in fact, it actually will. But Themistocles himself had a real serious problem. His own Greek allies were getting impatient because for about 2 weeks, these fleets were sitting off against each other, neither one of them moving. The Persians refusing to pull into the narrow passageway, and the Greeks are not willing to come out into the open. And so some of the Greeks who were the allies of the Athenian fleet were starting to talk about that maybe this is not the best tactic. He was concerned that some of his allies might take off. And so at this point in time, what he did was something that is very debatable on whether or not it was an ethical decision. It was heralded later on in Greek literature, and it is heralded to this day by a lot of historians as a brilliant decision. But to me, honestly, it's kind of stinks of treason. He decided to push the events because he was afraid that his allies would run off. He sent a messenger. He had a slave that, according to legend, was himself a Persian. He, under the cover of night, he basically sent a messenger directly to Xerxes, to the commander of the enemy fleet. And he sent the messenger with the message saying that, look, I am Themistocles, I am the leader of the Athenians, and we, the Athenians, don't trust our allies, and we're thinking about maybe siding with you. But if you want to go ahead and take care of these pesky Greeks that are bothering us as well, you need to lock them in this narrow passage, and you need to make sure they don't run away, because I think that they're going to take off in the morning. And you basically need to pin them down, and you need to fight them, and we, the Athenians, are going to hit them in the back. Xerxes Council, his circle of advisors was very doubtful of this particular message. But Xerxes, I think at this point in time, being fairly eager to succeed in this campaign, he decided to take Themistocles' words at face value. First of all, because he already had many Greek city-states switch over to his side. He basically knew who Themistocles was. And so he decided that was a good plan. And so what he did is he sent a detachment of an Egyptian detachment to go ahead and block the Greek fleet in the narrow passage. And so you could see right here where he sent the Egyptians to block them. And on the other hand, he himself moved forward and blocked the Greeks on this side. And by doing so, he moved into the narrow passage, which is exactly what the commander of the Athenian forces, of the Athenian fleet, wanted him to do. Now, we can sit here and debate whether or not this was a brilliant military, deception tactic, or whether or not Themistocles was actually debating on switching sides. I mean, there's no sources that indicate that, but I mean, if I was one of the allies, I would be very much questioning his motives, and I think some of them were, because they woke up in the morning realizing that they couldn't go anywhere, that they were blocked from both sides. Now, he did this, of course, without saying anything to any of his allies. So, having done this, now we have a situation where the Persians are funneling into this very narrow passage. So this is the map I was talking about. So we're talking about this Egyptian fleet that I was talking about that blocked the Greeks in, and then the Persian fleet moving in on the other side. When the Persians who had more ships moved into this narrow passageway, they suddenly were in a situation when they were kind of, when you're playing bumper cars and you have all these other cars around you and they're all bumping into you, the Persian ships were really crowded amongst themselves, and their ability to maneuver was suddenly very much blocked. From what I understand, our main character, one of our previous episodes, and that's Artemisia, the Persian Greek fleet admiral, the woman who was the amazing and unique character on the Persian side, she was empathetically advising Xerxes against making this move, but she was ordered, and so was the Phoenician captain. Early on, from what I understand, the Phoenician captain was killed, and so the Phoenician ships were left without direct command. The Persian ships were crowded and amongst themselves, and the Greeks at this point in time quite swiftly moved in. What ensued after that was more or less a slaughter. Persians were running into one another. They were having a hard time maneuvering and hard time getting out of the way. The only really part of the Persian fleet that was able to get out of this situation was Artemisia, who more or less ran into one of her own ships, one of her allied ships, on her way out, and managed to take out at least some of the Persian side of the Greek fleet out of this trap. The rest of the Persian ships were destroyed. The hoplites from the Greek ships more or less jumped on board, and they proceeded to slaughter the Persians who were not able to maneuver and were not able to get out of the way. And of course, Xerxes sat on the top of the hill because he had this habit of sitting on the top of the hill and trying to observe the battlefield, and he observed this entire catastrophe take place. The Greeks started out with less ships. They lost a lot less ships than the Persians did. The Persian fleet at the end of this battle pretty much was decimated. But it was enough of a disaster and enough of a calamity to where Xerxes decided to take what was left of, basically to cut his losses and get the heck out of there. Mardonius, which was his land commander, and also Artemisia, which was his only remaining naval commander, pursued him to stop trying to command the military and get the heck out of Dodge, because he was obviously not the best man for this war. And they also were generally worried about, it's not good when the king himself is leading the army and the army is losing. Xerxes, after some hesitation, did take their advice, and he did take off. And Artemisia was able to help him save face, as I've mentioned in our episode when we were talking about her story, by getting out a lot of the riches that they've been able, they meaning the Persians, been able to rob the conquered Greek city-states of, away from the pursuing Greek ships. And so this was pretty much the breaking point of the entire conflict, though neither side yet knew this. Neither the Greeks knew that they have won, nor did the Persians necessarily know that they have lost. Xerxes, when he departed, left a very strong force under the command of Mardonius, still on mainland Greece. And that is going to be the next little bit of our conversation. But I think I'm going to see if anybody else has anything else to say, and then I'll let you jump in, David.
And again, as a reflection of the Persian Empire, how they built their army, it's such a collection of menageries of people and places, and to get all of those peoples and places and working together as one cohesive unit is very difficult. They may have had the numbers, but it's very difficult to get them all work together. And then in Salamis, you have essentially a hired navy from the Phoenicians.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And so you're having another people, the Phoenicians, that's your navy, and it's a hired navy. And so how cohesively does that work together in warfare? In commerce, that's one thing, but in warfare, it's another. It's different.
I think you have a point, and here's the thing. I mean, the Phoenicians were exceptionally loyal allies to the Persians all throughout. Well, they were loyal allies to whoever conquered that area because they usually were just the fleet. But the Phoenicians' motivation for getting involved in this entire conflict to begin with really was a commercial clash with the Ionian city-states. So they were, to put it very crudely, were fighting for the sake of better profits. The other thing is Artemisia, as we talked about her before, was an ambitious woman it's a unique case of a female naval commander at that time, who I think had a lot to prove. And so she went above and beyond her expected role, I think, in trying to, first of all, protect her loyal Greek section of the fleet that took her years, I'm sure, to gather, who had personal loyalty to her and whom she treasured greatly, and was not going to be destroyed by Xerxes' miscalculation. So that's why I think she acted so effectively in the situation. But overall sense that I get is that Xerxes was not an effective manager. Not only was he not necessarily an effective commander, at least in this campaign, because I think he underestimated his enemies and the terrain and the difficulties. Not only were they pursued by constant, and I mean, throughout this whole campaign, it kind of reminds me of the Mongolian attempt to conquer Japan, where time after time a storm comes and just destroys your fleet. And just like Mongolians, the Persians were not exactly a naval power. They were more of a land power. As we've said before, Persians can't swim. That's kind of a running joke. But I think that Xerxes was not necessarily the brilliant military mind that he imagined himself to be. And this was not going to be the easy, glorious war that he was hoping it was going to turn out to be, to boost his reputation and his glory within the empire. Because I think that originally his whole purpose for this war was really inward propaganda, more so than necessarily conquest of new territories. Because if you look at Greece, what really does Greece have to offer as far as the resources go to the Persian Empire? Not much. But I'm going to go ahead and let David jump in.
I want to second what Nathan just said about the Navy also being, the Phoenicians were the better part of it, but there were also Egyptians, Black Sea peoples. It was, again, a cosmopolitan force, and Greeks, the Ionian Greeks were a big part of it, like Artemisia, but some probably less loyal. At least that would be the case later, after in 479. Also, I want to point out that before this battle even takes place, the Persians had probably had something more than 1,000 ships. They were hit by 2 storms that were that probably cost them hundreds of ships. They were down to 600 by the time of from 1,000. They had used old transport ships to make the bridge across the Hellespont and for the land army to go through. It broke loose and ships were lost there. So this is getting to be a really expensive campaign for Xerxes. And as the war goes on, at Salamis, they are stopped. Understand that the Persian triremes or the Phoenician triremes were faster, they were a little lighter, and they would have been better off to engage the Greeks in open ocean or open sea, relatively open. Everything in that day and era wasn't too far from the coast. But the Greek ships were a little bit heavier built, and
they're basically trading ships, a lot of them.
Yeah, but the triremes, every Herodotus says that the Greek ships were heavier, which would have made them slower. But in closed waters, in that where Persia couldn't bring all its forces to bear at one time, Themistocles was right in luring them into doing. I kind of disagree with Julie. Sun Tzu says all warfare is based in deception. So telling what lies he had to get the Persian fleet to attack was the thing to do, in my opinion.
And it's kind of an interesting debate on whether or not how I feel about Thermopylae' decision to deceive his allies and to force the hand of the Persians, and how the Greeks and his allies felt about it at the time were two. There are two big differences. Me or David or anybody else can feel however we feel like about it in the end of the day, but in reality, though later Greek historians heralded his decision as a very wise one that led to a sound that Greeks later found out was a resounding victory. They didn't know that at the time. At the time, it seems that the Athenians, at least, were not very appreciative of that particular tactic. Because what happened is complete failure to break the back of the resistance, the Greek resistance in the Battle of Salamis. The Persian fleet, whatever was left of it, retreated back to Persia. We got to remember that on top of everything else, Xerxes did have an empire to govern that had its own administrative, bureaucratic, financial, and so on and so forth issues, plus other wars, plus a bunch of other things going on. And the land army that was left in mainland Greece at this point in time was looking at, okay, we're sitting in Athens, we have many, many horses. Horses like to eat a lot of grass. There's not a lot of grass in Athens. Winter is coming, and we don't have a fleet to supply us anymore. The remaining Persian, even though they were now the elite core forces, some cavalry and some elite fighting, both light and heavy infantry. People need to eat. Horses need to eat about 10 times as much as people. Mountain horse, correct me if I'm wrong on that, but that's the general consensus is about, and a horse eats about 10 times as much as a person. And we don't have anybody friendly around us. So what Mardonius decides to do, he decides to go ahead and pull back. He pulls back to this state right here, which is by Boeotia, was its capital of Thebes, which at this point in time has remained more or less neutral up until this point in time, because they've got hit pretty heavily by the advancing Persians in the first place. And they just don't want to fight anymore. So they more or less swear allegiance to the Persians, and they tell the rest of the Greeks, go away, we don't want to fight with you. Macedonia and Thessaly are fairly loyal at this point in time to the Persians because, again, they've been steamrolled over already. They don't need any more of that. Of course, Athens is sacked and burned before Mardonius retreats, and so for the winter, Mardonius coops up in more or less friendly Boeotia, which gives him the access line through, friendly territories back to home if he needs to retreat or if he needs to get supplies and so on and so forth. Meanwhile, the Greeks do what the Greeks do best. They get at each other's throats, and they more or less have they bicker, and the Spartans and the Athenians start arguing over who won what battle and who has a bigger, better male sexual organ. And they start waving it around, and the two powers, of course, in their mistrust of each other and in their attempt to aggrandize themselves and lessen the contribution of the opposite side, they wind up being at each other's throats. Now, the Spartans, being the epic and mighty Spartans, they do recognize this victory that was orchestrated by the trickery of Themistocles. And so they decide, to add fuel to the fire. They decide to honor Themistocles with a ceremony back in Sparta, where they give him some pretty lavish gifts, which Spartans don't tend to give to any non-Spartans. While the Athenians return back to Athens to find Athens, of course, burned to the ground, their temples burned, their statues were toppled or sacked. And when elated and excited and victorious, Themistocles comes back to his capital city, with beautiful new chariot that the Spartans gave him. The Athenians look at him and say, dude, okay, yeah, you won us this battle. Look at our city. We don't have a city. He does not get reelected. And so this military mastermind, for lack of a better term, does not really have much of a part in the war after this point in time. And guess who takes control of the further military plans by Athens? Well, the person who takes control of further military plans by Athens is Aristides. His own Aristides, his previous opponent, his political enemy, the guy that he managed to get ostracized quite successfully from Athens recently before this whole war happened, and the guy that he had to bring back when they were facing the Persian invasion. Well, now our very proper, very conservative, more or less, and very land-oriented Aristides is in charge of the Athenian war effort, and Thermopylae is pretty much out of the picture. Well, the Persians, Mardonius, remember, is not a foolish man. He knows something about politicking. He hears, of course, of this dissent among the Greek ranks. And so he decides to maybe try to solve this entire problem by a bloodless advance. He reaches out to the Athenians and he proposes them, look, you have this problem with Sparta. Sparta is not your friend. You've never been friends with Sparta. Why don't you ally with us against Sparta? And under the wing of the beautiful, glorious Persian Empire, you shall be happy, and you shall be glorious, and you shall be, a very rich satrapy of Persia. Because for the Persians, really, again, this is not about military conquest. This is not a war of resources. It's a war of prestige. Xerxes is, what really matters to Xerxes, and I think Mardonius understands it even better than Xerxes himself. I think Mardonius is a little bit more politically astute. Is the fact that we don't need to necessarily throw away a bunch of lives of our people. What we need to do is just basically be able to come home and say, look, they submitted. We punished the Greeks for their meddling in our state affairs back when Darius was still alive. We have righted the loss that, the setback that Darius had suffered. And, at that point in time, they can just call it good and retreat. He offers great rich gifts to the Athenians. He actually offers to pay for the rebuilding of Athens. He says, look, ally with us and we will undo everything we did. We'll help you restore your temples. We'll be friends. And Athens pretty much says, go take a hike. And they do this very loudly, very vocally, making sure that the Spartans are very well aware of the fact that they turned down this friendly gesture from the Persians. Okay, says Mardonius. And so as soon as the spring comes and as soon as the weather allows it, he musters up his forces and starts marching on Athens again. And of course, Athens sent to Sparta and says, Spartans, help, you're the mighty Spartans. This is a land war, we're good at sea. Send us your hoplites, you're the best fighters here. Come, save us, Mardonius is coming. Look, we didn't ally with Mardonius. No, really, we didn't. And Spartans say, And Spartans don't come. Because Spartan society, generally speaking, is fairly conservative. Spartans do not like, they're very protectionist in their policy in general. The fact that they got so actively involved in the previous engagement is not very characteristic of them. Generally, Spartans like to sit in Sparta because they have all these helots, the suppressed local population that they have to manage, and they don't like to leave their territory. They don't say much of anything. Spartans are not known for talking much. They just don't come. And so once again, there's Athens and there's the advancing Persian army. And Athenians who just started rebuilding their city get back up on the ships and run back to Salamis. And Mardonius takes Athens a second time. And this time he's very not happy with them. He sacks and robs it and destroys it. He is doing this in hopes that the Athenians will see what folly it was to turn down his to turn down his friendly political offer, and that maybe if he presses them enough, they will stop this foolishness and they will just surrender and ally with the Persians, and then together they can put the Spartans in check, and he can go home and say, "Great king, your request that you had of me, your mission has been accomplished. We're great. Let's move on." Well, as he is advancing, he again sends out yet another proposition to the Athenians saying, "Look, people, you're sitting there on the island. Your city's been sacked twice. The Spartans, where are the Spartans? Do you see any Spartans? I don't see any Spartans. So maybe you're going to ally with us after all." The Athenians at this point in time send a panicked message back to Sparta saying, "Look, guys, we have our back up against the wall here. So if you don't do something about this, I think we might be actually allying with the Persians because you don't leave us much choice." "It's all right," say the Spartans. "We already have a force on the way to assist you in your difficult times," which kind of catches the Athenians by surprise. But Spartans finally decide, okay, yeah, this is serious. And if these guys ally with the Persian Empire, we are pretty much finished. So they deploy a fighting force, and they deploy a fighting force of unprecedented scale. This is probably the largest numerically force that, and of course, when I say Spartans and the Athenians, you got to remember that there's a lot of different city-states involved in this whole undertaking. I mean, every little polis sends a couple of people. I mean, by a couple of people, I mean, some of them might be able to muster up 600 hoplites. Some of them may have much larger numbers, but the two main powers, the powers that are able to supply the most men, the most power, really are Sparta and really are Athens. Athens have the fleet still, and they are able to supply about 7,000 or so hoplites. The Spartans, according to their different accounts of numbers, we will talk about that some more, but the Spartans are not only bringing their elite hoplite troops, who are being led, by the way, I'm going to try to pronounce this name right, because my translation from Russian to English and back is not always very friendly, but it is Pausanias, I think it's pronounced in English, Pausanias, who is actually the nephew of the king Leonidas, who had so gloriously died at Thermopylae, whose son is still too young to be really nominated anything. And so his nephew winds up being the guy who's placed in charge, temporarily nominated as the regent for the young, budding new king. And Pausanias not only brings his, according to different accounts, around 5,000 hoplites, because they lost so many people at Thermopylae, because they could not leave these constantly rebellious, very dangerous helots, the suppressed population of their territory behind. According to some accounts, they bring with them about up to 39,000 of the helots. 35 to 39,000. Bottom line is the total, according to some accounts, the total Peloponnesian military contingent from all the city-states, and that's the Athenians and everybody else, is for the first time close to the number that the Persians are actually presenting at the battlefield, and we're talking about roughly 80,000 peoples. Now that's including the Helots who have been living in terror of the Spartans for generations, who are probably not properly armed and who do not represent much of anything other than cannon fodder, really. To me personally, and I've talked to David about this, I've talked to Nathan a little bit about this, I'm having a hard time understanding why the Helots did not, quite frankly, just flip sides and hit the Spartans in the back during the next decisive battle. Because the kind of terror that these people have lived under for generations previous, I mean, it either completely broke their spirit, which obviously it didn't if they were able to fight at all. I don't understand why they fought on the Greek side. I understand that they were technically Greeks. They were the same Mycenaean Greeks that once upon a time were the Spartans from whom Helen of Troy was kidnapped, that were great and famous warriors at the time of, days long gone. But such an oppressed ethnic majority, because they were if you have 5,000 Spartans and you have that many, 35 to 39,000 Helots, even if they're armed with sticks and stones, it's hard for me psychologically to understand why they did not just pick up those sticks and stones and start beating the other Greeks on the head. Any thoughts on that?
Sparta had the military fighting tradition for a long time. They were quite rightly feared in the area.
Yeah, and I think you do have a point. I'm sorry, I do not know how to pronounce your name. Is it Yazdi? But I do think you have a point. I think that their families probably were. That's a good point, actually. If their families were held hostage, that explains everything. But what we're going to say, Nathan?
They're in a toxic relationship with the Spartans, and it's what they know, and they'd rather, like so many toxic relationships, you'd rather maintain and fight and keep what you know than go, have there be something else that you don't know. And it's conditioning.
That actually would make a lot of sense to me, Nathan, because maybe it's just on a very large scale in that circumstance versus a small family scale or something.
Well, and that makes sense also because, as we know, at least legendary speaking, the Spartans been weeding out the strongest, the most initiative-driven, the most capable of the Helots for generations, just randomly killing them, I assume that anybody who had any leadership skills, any warrior skills by this point in time has been more or less genetically bred out by a simple process of elimination. So I assume that the initiative among these people and their spirit was somewhat suppressed. They've been rising and rising and rising in rebellion after rebellion and failing and facing this horrible, really, policy of just random killing terror. I don't know. It's something I tried to look into and research upon, and it's just, there were just so many more of them, and I assumed that they were the cannon fodder that pretty much was used as filler for the lower Greek numbers on the battlefield.
But speaking specifically, you look down, and we're afforded the view to look down history another 150 years. And you see what Epimenides from Thebes, Boeotia, and what he was able to bring together in those people. So it wasn't complete. There's a point where any people says enough is enough. And it sometimes, and it may come from a variety of sources. Sometimes it comes from an interior source, sometimes it's an outside source, but there's a unifying force to say, look, enough is enough. And they did eventually, and we're getting way ahead of ourselves here. They stood up.
We are. Okay. I agree with all of that, particularly that unhealthy relationship and the fact that the Helots had been abused. There may have been another element here, because Herodotus talks about 5,000 Spartans coming, but also 5,000 other Lacedaemonian hoplites. So and the interesting thing about, I saw a map today, and I don't have it, but the western parts of Greece and the Peloponnese particularly were much more tribal and not as urban as the Ionians and the seafaring people around the Aegean. That may have had an element in it. But for whatever reason, and when we get to the Battle of Plataea, there's indication that there were about 34,000 frontline hoplites, and yeah, something like that. We'll check that, but about 80,000 overall. So you're looking at a lot of light troops, a lot of missile troops, a lot of just skirmishers that would engage and then just melt away before they actually hit the line. And the casualty numbers may reflect that. We'll deal with that when we get to Plataea. But I think, and at the end of the day, you also got to remember they were Greeks. The Hellenes were Greeks, and that was part of it too, I guess.
Well, and yeah, but I mean, my argument to that, as I've said before, I mean, so were the Ionian Greeks. They were also Greeks, and yet they were fighting on the Persian side. I mean, well, I understand that, but they didn't know that going into the battle. I mean, the Thebans and the Athenians, they all allied with the Persians because the Persian Empire seemed to be more sure bet at the time. I also think that might have been the factor that these people were offered some preferences, maybe some sort of, I mean, even if they knew that their family would be safe for a generation from, being targeted by the Spartan headhunts, or is anything short of promise of freedom, or even the chance at military glory, which those people have not been able to achieve because they were Greeks too. They used to know military glory. They were the people that Homer's Iliad was singing about, and they've been in this horrible animal-like condition for generations. I think just the chance to be a warrior and be on that battlefield may have played a factor. I mean, I suppose we will never know. I'm sure that there are studies on the subject matter. I have not been able to find a lot of those, because I think because the Helots did not leave any literature behind. We don't have any narratives from the Helots themselves. It's really hard to get inside of these people's heads and figure out what their motives were, but a lot of them died on that battlefield that we're about to discuss in the next episode when we get to the Battle of Plataea. We are out of time, so go ahead.
Just very briefly, the Helots were not given any formal education. They were not allowed to write. They were not allowed to study or go to school, and that's just so. And again, that supports what you said. There's nothing written about what they lived through.
Right, and these are people who used to have states. I mean, if you look at the Iliad, I mean, again, Helen of Troy, I mean, they've had the first, they were the same developmental stage as the rest of the Greeks, at least the Achaean Greeks. They used to have written language. I mean, they used to have culture. They used to have a voice, really, and they've been more or less beaten back into the Stone Age at this point in time. I think that's part of, I think that there was some tribal formations in that territory that were still tribal from before all of this. But I think that the people who were already at the stage of forming a state, forming some sort of a cohesive organization have been forbidden. I mean, again, back to the Mongols. I mean, this is very similar to what the Chinese did to the Mongols after the fall of the Mongolian Empire, when the Mongols were forbidden from having any metal, for example, at all. Which again sent those peoples back into Stone Age after the glory of the Genghis Khan and everything else. And when you put a peoples in a situation when they cannot use any of the advantages of the progress of civilization, and they have no access to education, no ability to organize, no right to even, I mean, from what I understand, I mean, they were prohibited from socializing in groups of more than one, pretty much, especially the males. And probably males were just randomly targeted, especially, and any male who maybe would not look away from a Spartan, because Spartans were so numerically outnumbered in their land. They really lived more or less in little fortified forts and went hunting out into the surrounding territories against the population that was, on the one hand, enslaved and servile to them, on the other hand, is extremely hostile. So they had to really rule with an absolute, the reason why they were such formidable warriors is because they were constantly in a state of warfare within their own state, which the other Greeks really looked upon as, you guys are a little on the crazy side, I think. But that's why they were such formidable warriors, because unlike other Greeks, which just like the Persians, really their militaries were, other policies militaries were basically citizens who would put down whatever their craft or whatever their trade was, pick up arms and go defend their homeland. Spartans were constantly in that state of war. I mean, they were born in it and they died in it because they were at war with their own population.
The average Greek hoplite was male was about 140 pounds, about 5'7", 5'8".
Right.
And roughly, the average. And they wore accumulated between their helmet, their breastplate, their greaves, their shield, their spear. They had about 70 pounds of armor.
Right.
Half their body weight. And so basically it's, they've effectively been turned into, if you will, land tanks. And it's, they figured out that through that industry of producing armor, that you could turn an average person into a very effective warrior. And someone that puts down their trade, puts down their whatever they're doing for the day, and has to go to war, and make them very effective. And on the other hand, and it touches to something David talked about earlier, is that when you consider that, consider the amount of industry it takes, not just on the Greek side, but on the Persian side, the absolute amount of industry and productive effort it takes to go to war. And all of the resources that are being dedicated to this, to build navies, to build armor, to do all of this, to feed people as they are warring and they need to be fed and you have crops in the field. It takes tremendous industry to go to war. And I think this is very often lost in the historical documentation of these conflicts.
If anything, the Persians probably amassed too great of an army initially. Xerxes, after Salamis, would take much of it home, and it would be a more manageable feeding all those troops and things. But back to the Helots, they had some kind of economic, the reason Spartans could be professional soldiers, there was some kind of economic tie, some kind of feudalism going on there with the Helots that allowed the Spartans to be full-time warriors, and nobody else in Greece could be. They were in that valley right in the middle of the Peloponnese. And so there had to be, we don't know much about it, what form that feudalism took, but somebody was supplying the Spartans with grain, obviously. And and you have those, and I still don't understand where those other 5,000 hoplites came from. They were some kind of middle class in between there. I would guess, but that's pretty much what I have on it. But I absolutely agree with you. the effort it took to go to war is often underestimated, and still is.
Okay, guys, we are way over time, so I think we're going to wrap it up for today. But I think we need to go ahead and do the Battle of Plataea next time, which is going to be a very interesting encounter. And yeah, I'm just keeping it. Yeah, well, both of the battles that took place that day, Mycala and Plataea battles, but the Plataea battle being the better known one and fairly convoluted military encounter between the two armies that really decided the fate not only of the entire war, but of some individual fighters within that conflict, and really turned the tide of history and turned the world into the world we know it today, for better or for worse. I think up until that war, really, the Greeks were a peripheral conglomeration of bickering locales, really. And after this, that battle, not only did the Persian retreat, expansion in that direction completely stop, but it also, I think it began very much that standoff between the East and the West that we're still living in today, and that has been shaping civilization for centuries and centuries and centuries to come, all the way to the modern days. So does anybody else want to say anything else before we wrap up?
Just a quick comment.
Go ahead.
And that is what's very interesting. One of the things I find very interesting, and I really love that is being discussed here psychologically in this conflict, is that the Persian wars that we're talking about between Greek and Persia created it in history. It created a schism that the Trojan War did not, and yet we're still talking about a conflict between those people. The Trojan War did not create this level of conflict.
Right.
The Persian
it actually kind of seems to have joined the sides.
Yes, and so I find that very interesting. And I'll just that's an open air comment for the group.
Nathan, can I ask you for a favor? Is that the helmet?
What's that?
Is that the helmet behind you?
Yes.
Can you hold it up for a second?
Yeah. This was a.
Yeah.
This is a project.
I know. I just want. I mean, we've talked about it a lot, and I just want to see what it looks like as we've talked about it. That's so awesome. Talk for a minute. We can see it. Talk for a minute.
Yeah. So this is a project I started early this year, and I just wanted to recreate a Corinthian helmet, and so I started with the wax, and got online, met a wonderful community of people that make recreations. This is solid bronze. It's 16 pounds, and it is historically accurate.
That's awesome.
And it is
Beautiful
absolutely menacing.
Oh yeah.
It's and it's all due credit to, because the Greeks did not just create weapons and armor. They had a theatrical influence on what they were presenting on the battlefield.
Right.
And that's one of the things that I learned about the creation of this helmet. And it is absolutely, it's something else.
Maybe next time you can talk a little bit about the logistics of wearing it, because I assume that there was some sort of padding that went on underneath and all that lovely stuff, because we were talking about Greece where the temperatures were toppling, 100 degrees oftentimes during these events.
Absolutely, yes. And they were lined, they were padded.
Right.
These were passed down from generation to generation.
Gathered at battlefields, I assume, by the winning side.
Oh yeah. Come back with your shield on it.
Right.
In the 5th century, no Persian, not the mortals.
Yeah, nobody else in 5th century. David is saying that in 5th century, nobody else had that kind of equipment.
Oh no, no, not at all. No.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. It's really awesome to see. And Nathan, thank you for sharing that with us. I just saw that in the background, and I was wanting to, have everybody take a look at it. But yeah, we will see everybody on the 21st. I'm excited. We still got a ways to go before we're done with the Greeks. And I was telling David today that once we're done with the Greeks, I want to do something across the world entirely. Like, I don't know, like the Inuit or anything, Australia, anything the heck away from the Greeks, because we're going to be on the Greeks for another probably three or so episodes before we all go, and I think I'm going to do Australia next for fun. Well, it's really good seeing everyone, guys. Take care. Bye.
Be well.
Bye.
Over campfire, electrical glow. Both cast our shadows as our legends unfold. We are the archetypes that exist within every man's soul. And we will live forever as long as stories are told. We are the archetypes that exist within every man's soul. And we will live forever or as long as stories are told. We are the archetypes that exist within every man's soul.